My name is Evan, and if you'd asked me a year ago how my relationship with my family was, I probably would have said it was complicated. That's the polite word, right? Complicated. Not good, not terrible, just tangled. I've always been the one in the family who gets brushed aside. My cousin Ezra, for example, could show up late to every holiday dinner and my parents would still treat him like he was some kind of star guest. Me? I could get straight A's, land scholarships, work 2 part-time jobs, and somehow my parents would find a way to criticize me for not making time for family. Graduation was supposed to be different. It felt like a milestone I had earned. For years of grinding, late nights in the library, balancing classes and work, and putting myself through it without leaning on anyone, I thought, maybe just maybe, they'd finally look at me with something other than that disappointed squint they always seemed to have ready. A month before the ceremony, my mom started dropping hints. She'd say things like, "Oh, Evan, you have no idea what's waiting for you after you walk across that stage." My dad, who usually never gets involved in anything that isn't about him, actually smiled at me once and said, "It's going to be the kind of celebration you'll never forget." And then there was my partner, Lila. She would squeeze my hand whenever I asked about it and whisper, "It's perfect. You'll see." The way she said it, soft, secretive, almost rehearsed, should have set off alarms in my head. But I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that for once, they were all on my side. So, I didn't push too hard. I told myself, stop being suspicious, stop expecting the worst. Maybe they're actually proud of you this time. Maybe the years of feeling like you didn't belong in your own family are finally over. The night before graduation, I barely slept. My roommate joked that I was like a kid before Christmas. I laughed it off, but he wasn't entirely wrong. I woke up buzzing with nervous energy, straightened my gown 3 times, made sure my cap was pinned perfectly, and walked out the door feeling lighter than I had in years. The ceremony itself was everything I dreamed. Hearing my name called, walking across that stage, shaking hands, it was surreal. I scanned the audience, and I swear I saw them. My mom, dad, Lila, my cousins, even Aunt Mirielle, who usually finds some excuse to skip anything that doesn't revolve around her son. They were all there, clapping and smiling. My chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to pride. Afterward, my parents hugged me, took pictures, and said, "We'll meet you at the hall. You'll love what we've done." The hall. That's what they kept calling it. I remember standing outside the building, my heart racing, telling myself, this is it. This is where it all changes. I opened the door and stepped inside, and froze. The room was empty. No decorations, no music, no tables, not even a chair out of place. Just rows of plain walls and silence. At first, I thought maybe I was early. I checked my phone, but the time matched exactly what my mom had told me. I waited. 10 minutes. 30. An hour. I kept pacing, refreshing my messages, expecting someone to pop out yelling surprise. But nothing happened. It was only after 2 hours of sitting alone in that empty hall that I got the first notification. Then another. And another. Curious, and honestly, desperate, I opened Instagram. And there they were. My entire family. My partner. My cousins. Sitting in a fancy restaurant I had never even been invited to. Glasses raised. Plates full. Laughter frozen in pictures and videos. The caption across one story made my stomach drop so fast I thought I might be sick. Celebrating without him. Cheers. I didn't respond. I didn't text. I didn't call. But the next morning, that's when it all really began. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. It wasn't just a few notifications. It was dozens stacked on top of each other, spilling over like someone had opened a floodgate overnight. For a moment, I thought maybe it was congratulations from classmates or professors, people who'd seen the ceremony. That small hope carried me long enough to swipe the screen open. But it wasn't them. It was my family. Message after message, group chats, individual texts, even missed calls. At first glance, the tone almost looked cheerful, but the more I read, the more my stomach twisted. My mom's first text read, "Evan, we waited for you for so long. Why didn't you show up? Everyone was asking about you." I reread it, my jaw tightening. Waited for me? I had been in that empty hall, sitting there like a fool, while they were posting videos of themselves eating lobster and laughing into champagne glasses. Then came my dad's. Disappointing, son. After all the effort we put into planning that dinner, You didn't even show. People thought it was disrespectful. The audacity of that nearly made me drop the phone. Effort. Planning. From where I stood, it looked like they'd gone out of their way to exclude me. And then there was Lila. Her messages were somehow worse, because they were layered with this smug undertone, like she expected me to apologize. I don't understand why you didn't come, Evan. You knew how important it was to my parents that you show up. Everyone asked about you. They thought you were being rude. Please don't make this about you. That last line hit me like a brick. Don't make this about you. My graduation. My supposed surprise. Yet somehow, according to her, I was selfish for not magically appearing at a dinner I hadn't even been invited to. The group chat with my cousins was filled with photos from the night before. Ezra had posted a clip of himself giving a mock toast. To Evan, he said in the video, holding up his glass while everyone laughed. Wherever he is. Guess he had better things to do. The comments that followed made my chest burn. Maybe he got lost on the way to his own party. Classic Evan. He's probably sulking somewhere. Each word stung more than the last. Not because they were true, but because this was exactly the narrative my family loved to push. That I was ungrateful, dramatic, the odd one out who never appreciated their efforts. I didn't reply. Not yet. I set the phone down and just stared at the ceiling, my thoughts running in circles. Part of me wanted to call them out immediately, unleash everything I had bottled up for years. But another part of me knew they wanted that. They wanted me to snap, to prove their point, to give them ammunition for the next time they painted me as the problem. So I stayed quiet. But silence doesn't mean acceptance. Silence, in my case, meant planning. Around noon, my mom called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that was almost comical in its hypocrisy. Evan, honey, we're all so hurt you didn't come. You embarrassed us in front of everyone. Do you know how many people asked where you were? Do you know how awkward that was for me? We worked so hard on this surprise, and you ruined it. Call me back when you're ready to apologize. Apologize. That word echoed in my head. They excluded me from my own graduation celebration, humiliated me publicly, and now I was expected to apologize? By evening, the narrative had already begun to shift. A few relatives texted me things like, I'm sure you had your reasons, but your mom looked so upset, or, you know how much family means to your dad. Why would you miss something like that? It was spreading. They were laying the groundwork, painting me as the one who abandoned them, as the one who turned my back on family. The only person who hadn't directly texted me yet was Aunt Mirielle, which, honestly, made me even more uneasy. She's always been the ringmaster of family drama, the one who whispers in ears and twists stories until they barely resemble the truth. If she was quiet, it meant she was waiting to strike at the moment that would sting the most. By the second day, I had stopped opening most of the messages. I could already predict what they said. Variations of guilt trips, attempts to rewrite the story, or thinly veiled scolding. But then, late that night, I got a single text from Ezra that I couldn't ignore. Next time you want to act too good for your family, at least don't waste our time. We had a great night without you. I stared at it for a long time. That word, without, felt like the truth leaking through all their fake concern. They hadn't forgotten me. They hadn't made a mistake. They had planned it this way, to celebrate without me, to remind me, even on one of the most important days of my life, that I was an outsider in my own family. And that was the moment something shifted. For years, I'd swallowed the bitterness, let them get away with their digs and games, told myself to be the bigger person. But sitting there, rereading Ezra's smug words, I realized I was done. Completely done. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to beg for explanations. I wasn't going to play into their version of events. No, I was going to make sure they felt the weight of what they had done. Slowly, carefully, in a way they wouldn't see coming. The only question was where to start. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and opened my laptop. I had an idea. The coffee had gone cold by the time I stopped staring at the screen. My laptop was open, cursor blinking on a blank document, but my thoughts weren't on schoolwork or job applications. They were circling back to that one word that wouldn't leave my head. Without. Celebrating without him. It wasn't just about graduation anymore. It was about a pattern, one that had been set long before I stepped into that empty hall. This wasn't the first time I'd been sidelined. It was just the boldest, the most blatant. And something in me snapped when I realized they no longer even cared to hide it. I thought back to all the times growing up when I'd been treated as an afterthought. The Christmas when my brother, before he dropped out of college, got a brand new laptop and I was handed a secondhand one with sticky keys. The birthday dinners where my parents forgot to invite any of my friends but went all out for Ezra's with balloons, speeches, and rented space at the country club. Even in small, everyday ways, being left out of group photos, being told to be patient while everyone else got their way first, it was always there. And now, after all of that, they had chosen my graduation, the one day that was supposed to be mine, to make their point loud and clear. I was still the outsider. I scrolled through the messages again, slowly this time. I noticed patterns I hadn't caught at first. My mom's tone was dripping with disappointment, but strategically framed as concern, the kind of language she'd used my whole life to twist things around. My dad's message was shorter, sharper, all about how I had embarrassed him, as if my absence had stained his reputation. And Lila's words, "Don't make this about you," were the final confirmation that she wasn't standing beside me at all. She had chosen them. That realization stung more than I wanted to admit. Lila had been the one person I thought would ground me, the one who whispered encouragement during my long nights of studying, who said she believed in me when no one else seemed to. Yet when it mattered most, she smiled at me in the days leading up to graduation, knowing full well that the perfect surprise wasn't meant for me. She had known, and she had let it happen anyway. I didn't delete her texts. Not yet. Instead, I started saving everything. Screenshots of the Instagram posts, their captions, every message, even the voicemail from my mom. It might sound paranoid, but something told me I would need them. My family loved to rewrite history. I could already imagine them, a few months down the line, telling anyone who'd listened that I had stormed off on graduation day, that they had begged me to join them, that I had chosen to isolate myself. Not this time. Not with proof in my hands. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Aunt Mirielle. Her timing, as always, was calculated. She hadn't said a word while the dust was still settling. But now, when the narrative was shifting and people were already beginning to question me, she stepped in. "Evan, I don't know what's gotten into you. Your mother was in tears. Do you understand how hard she worked to plan that dinner? I told her not to bother, that you wouldn't appreciate it, but she insisted. And this is how you repay her? By making her look like a fool." I could almost hear her voice reading the words aloud, every syllable coded in that syrupy tone she used to disguise her venom. That message sat heavier than the rest, because Mirielle wasn't just another relative. She was the one who had always sharpened the blade before handing it to my parents. She was the one who had whispered in my mom's ear that I was too ungrateful, too distant, too cold. She had compared me to Ezra for as long as I could remember, praising him for his charm, while reminding me that I lacked it. And now here she was again, making sure the story spread just the way she wanted. I didn't reply, but inside, I felt something solidify. For the rest of that week, I kept to myself. I went to work, smiled politely at coworkers who asked about my graduation, and lied through my teeth. Oh, it was nice, just a quiet family dinner. The truth was too humiliating to share. But every night, when I got home, I opened that folder on my laptop and added more. Screenshots, notes, dates, times, anything I could collect. It might sound obsessive, but I wasn't just documenting what happened. I was building a foundation. Because for once, I wasn't going to let them erase me from my own story. By the fourth day, the messages started to thin out. The group chat grew quieter, as if they had grown tired of pretending to be outraged. But that didn't mean the pressure was gone. It had simply shifted. Lila showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't answer the door when I saw her through the peephole. She looked nervous, clutching her phone in one hand and smoothing down her hair with the other. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. "Evan," she said softly, almost rehearsed, like she was already slipping into a script. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside, and she walked in, her perfume filling the space like it always did. She sat on the edge of my couch, staring at her hands. "I don't understand why you're shutting everyone out," she began. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Your mom just wanted to do something special. She didn't mean to hurt you." I sat across from her, silent. I wanted to see how far she would go without me interrupting. "Everyone's talking about how upset she is," she continued, glancing at me for the first time. "And honestly, Evan, you disappearing only makes it worse. If you would just apologize." I held up a hand. Apologize. The word hung in the air between us, heavy. Lila hesitated. I know it sounds unfair, but sometimes it's better to smooth things over, even if it wasn't your fault. You know how your mom is. She won't let this go until you make the first move. That was the moment I realized Lila wasn't on my side. Not really. She wasn't here to understand, to listen. She was here to convince me to fold, to go back to playing the role my family needed me to play. I leaned back, studying her. For years, I had thought she was different from them. But now I could see the same patterns in her words, the same subtle shifts in blame. I'm not apologizing, I said quietly. She frowned. Evan. No. I cut in, my voice steadier now. Not this time. For the first time in days, I felt something close to clarity. Lila sighed, stood, and looked down at me with an expression that made my stomach twist. Half disappointment, half pity. You're making a mistake. Don't say I didn't warn you. And with that, she left. I sat in the silence of the apartment long after the door clicked shut. My chest felt tight, not from sadness but from something else. Something sharper. They thought they could rewrite this. They thought they could guilt me into silence. They thought I would fold, like always. But not this time. That night, I opened my laptop again. Not to save screenshots this time, but to start writing. Plans. Names. Every single way I could turn their own games back on them. And I knew exactly where I was going to start. With Ezra. I started with Ezra because he was the one who had made the toast, the one who'd filmed the whole thing like it was some kind of prank, the one who'd loved every second of turning my humiliation into entertainment. He was loud, careless, and predictable. Three things that make people easy to manipulate if you pay attention. First, I spent a lot more time than I care to admit watching him. Not in a creepy way, just enough to notice his patterns. He posted a lot on social media. Brunches, gym check-ins, late-night bars, the occasional blurry selfie with friends. He liked showing off when he had money, even though he was always between jobs. He was proud of his image, and that meant public opinion mattered to him more than his actual behavior. He was allergic to anything that might chip that image. Second, he had a job he loved to brag about, sales at a regional startup that prided itself on networking culture. He'd told me once, pretty drunk, that if you had the right reputation you could get away with pretty much anything. Reputation, I realized, was his Achilles heel. It was how he kept his temporary lifestyle afloat. So I began quietly. No grand schemes, no big reveals, just small, accurate nudges aimed at the places that would hurt most. The first move was purely social. I created an anonymous account, no fake name, just a clean handle, 0 followers, and started following the people in Ezra's circles. I watched who commented on his posts, who attended his networking nights, who always laughed at his jokes. I found a few people who seemed fed up with him behind closed doors. That gave me leverage I didn't have to force. The information was already there, the exasperation already simmering. I didn't have to invent enemies for him. He made them himself. I also dug into the restaurant where they'd been celebrating. It turned out Ezra had a favorite waiter, a kid named Marco who always worked the back tables and had the kind of memory that made gossip dangerous. Marco was the sort of person who knew who came in on Thursday nights and who was on a first-name basis with the manager. I slid Marco a message, light, friendly, curious. I hinted that I'd been left on my own at the hall and that I was trying to piece together what had happened that night. I didn't have to lie. I asked questions and let Marco fill in gaps with his own impressionable candor. Marco told me small things at first, that Ezra had arrived late, that he'd insisted the table be moved to a corner so they could get more privacy, that someone, probably Ezra, had asked the manager not to let that guy in. Marco used hands to describe the motion, and I could hear the shrug even through the text. He didn't know the whole story, but he knew enough to make me realize they'd plotted to exclude me in person, not by accident. Armed with that, I changed gears. I started using my screenshots and saved messages more deliberately. I created a folder labeled Timeline and began combining trusted witness notes, screenshots of their stories, timestamps, anything that could show a pattern. Their posts that night, my time-stamped arrival at the hall, the empty room photos I'd taken, Marco's messages about their table, the voicemail from my mother. The goal was simple: create a single, undeniable timeline that contradicted their version. Not to shout about it immediately, but to have a weapon that could not be shrugged off as misunderstanding later. While I was building the timeline, I also started re-establishing my own social footing. For too long, I'd let family narratives define me to our wider circle. I reached out to a few classmates whom I trusted, people who'd actually seen me walk the stage, and shared the bare bones of what happened. I didn't go into revenge talk. I just asked them one favor. If anyone asked, would they confirm where they'd seen me that day? Their texts came back quick, supportive, and oddly relieving. They hadn't known what to say when random relatives texted them about Evan not showing up. Most people assumed the family knew best. Getting those confirmations felt like the first bricks in rebuilding my truth. Then I started the slow, deliberate part that required patience and nerves, undermining Ezra's reputation in small, surgical ways that felt proportionate rather than vindictive. I found a forum where local startups shared leads and networking tips. People in sales posted job openings and client leads there, and reputation mattered. I made a quiet post, anonymous, factual, asking if anyone had experience working with the sales rep named Ezra at Company X. The post was neutral on face value, just a question. Within hours, a few replies trickled in. One said he'd had a strange experience with Ezra where terms of a deal were misrepresented. Another mentioned Ezra promising guarantees he couldn't actually deliver. The thread was not dramatic, but it planted a seed. No lies, just honest recollections. At the same time, I reached out to someone important, a recruiter who'd hired a mutual contact a while back. I phrased my questions carefully, never accusing, always curious, as if I was trying to understand whether certain behaviors were career-limiting. The recruiter, bless them, was blunt but helpful. If a candidate is flashy and unreliable, they wrote, we see it quickly. It's hard to trust someone who overpromises to every new contact. That little message was like a match in dry tinder. I watched as Ezra's social glow dimmed slightly, not because of a single blow, but because the increments of truth added up. One person passed on a lead citing concerns about his reliability. Another avoided taking him to a group call. He started getting fewer invites to the casual client lunches he used to brag about. The first week I saw him replay a story about clients who just didn't get me, and I nearly laughed. That was his go-to explanation for every closed door. But I didn't want to be petty. I made sure everything I did could be traced to a factual root. I was careful to stay in the light. If anyone asked, I would be ready to show the timeline, dates, screenshots, witness messages. I wanted him to feel the consequences of his behavior without fabricating evidence. The moral line mattered to me. I wasn't trying to ruin someone. I was trying to make them accountable for a cruelty they and my family had normalized. While I was chipping away at Ezra's professional veneer, I also had to manage the emotional warfare at home. My mother called less, but when she did, it was to ask things that were almost apologetic yet coded in manipulation. Do you really want to make a scene? She asked once, in that voice that always sounded like concern. I played it cool and asked one question back. Why did you lie about the dinner? Why did you go without me? She faltered when I asked it directly. It's easy to keep a lie afloat when no one presses, but even easier to topple when you ask the same question the same way too many times. But the moment I had been planning toward wasn't about social ruin or making apologies happen. It was about forcing a confrontation that my family couldn't spin into victimhood. I wanted a setting where the timeline, the witnesses, and the truth would be visible to people who mattered. People outside our immediate family who could not be swayed by Mirielle's whispering or my mother's crocodile tears. That's where the College Alumni Association came in. They'd sent me a list of people who were conglomerates of different industries and, crucially, a few names of alumni who'd been friends with my parents for decades. If I could get a few of those people to look at the timeline, it would be harder for my parents to gaslight the narrative. They had always relied on social proof to validate their version of reality. If I could infiltrate their circle on neutral grounds, the rug might slip from under them. So I did something I hadn't imagined doing a month before. I invited a handful of alumni to a casual post-graduation meetup at a cafe downtown. I framed it as a celebration of my class. I emailed the alumni board, copied in a couple of professors I liked, and chose a date that I knew would ensure my parents had to choose whether to show up publicly or hide behind their private dinner. Then, under the invitation list, I made sure to include one person whose opinion mattered to my parents, Mrs. Albright, a longtime family friend who was known in our social circle for being practical and level-headed. It was risky. If my parents ignored the invitation and claimed ignorance, that would be one thing. If they showed up and tried to disrupt it, that would be another. I had to build contingency plans. I also made sure a few of my classmates, those who had seen me at the ceremony, would be there. I wasn't calling them as witnesses in front of my family so much as making the atmosphere one where their corroboration was natural and immediate. In the week leading up to the meetup, my nerves were all over the place. I rehearsed conversations, made sure the printed timeline was organized and readable, and kept my messages and social probes on hold so nothing accidental would surface. I told myself the meetup was about truth, not revenge, because it had to be. Revenge looks like a tantrum without a plan. What I was building was intention wrapped in restraint. On the day, I arrived early. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries. I felt ridiculous being nervous in a place that served oat milk lattes, but nerves do what nerves do. My classmates trickled in, friendly and surprised to see me so composed. Mrs. Albright arrived right on time, a woman in her 60s with steady eyes and a reputation for calling things as they were. When she sat down and offered me a warm, practical smile, something in my chest unclenched for the first time in weeks. Then my phone buzzed. A family group chat notification. I looked, and my heart sank. A photo from last night, another one, uploaded by Mirielle with the caption, "What a night. We had to celebrate without him, but we had a blast." It was the same narrative, polished and circulated. I felt anger rise, but I kept my composure. Mrs. Albright glanced at the screen and frowned. "That's odd," she said. "I thought there might be a small dinner after the ceremony, but I didn't know it was exclusive." Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was curious. It was the kind of tone that could open doors. Just as she said that, my phone rang. It was Marco, the waiter. He left a short voicemail. "If you want to know what happened that night, meet me at the restaurant in half an hour. I work tonight." My heart flipped. This was it. The first person who hadn't been shaped by family ties, who had seen the event happen, offering to say what he'd seen. I excused myself, told Mrs. Albright I'd be right back, and walked out into the sharp afternoon. I called Marco back immediately. He gave me a time to meet, and said he had a little more than he'd texted. "I don't want any trouble," he said quietly. "Just want to tell the truth." My pulse was loud in my ears as I hailed a cab. It felt like the first move in a match where both players were tense and waiting for the board to be upset. I kept thinking of the empty hall, of the photo caption, of Lila's voice telling me to smooth things over. I also kept thinking of something else. That this was the first time I was doing anything for myself that didn't involve swallowing everything I'd been given. When I stepped into the restaurant, the evening light made the place look warmer than the Instagram stories had allowed. Marco waved from a corner table. He looked uncomfortable, like someone aware of the courage it takes to speak up when others are silent. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside were a few printed receipts and a printout of the restaurant's reservation logs for the night. The table reservation was under Ezra's name. There was a note from the manager confirming that the party had requested privacy and that one guest had been asked not to be seated. Marco's voice was low when he said it. "They told me not to seat you." I felt bad. It didn't seem right. My fingers closed around the paper. The timeline was no longer just mine. It was becoming other people's record too. As I pocketed the printouts, I felt the hollow part of the night, the emptiness where my family's celebration should have been, solidify into something I could point to. Proof. Witnesses. A trail. I walked back to the cafe with the papers in my jacket and the kind of focus I hadn't felt in years. It was the calm before a storm. Only I was the one deciding when to pull the lightning. When I sat down, Mrs. Albright looked at me with an expression that was both expectant and slightly wary. She asked one question, the simplest and the most dangerous one. "Do you want me to know what really happened?" I looked around at the people who had come to support me, at the empty spot in my phone where Lila's name used to make my chest feel steady, and at the photo Mirielle had just posted, smug and careless. I could tell her everything. I could hand her the timeline, Marco's notes, the voicemail, and watch the rug of excuses get pulled out from under their carefully arranged narrative. But whatever I decided next would change something. It would be a move I could not unmake. I set the papers on the table, and for the first time since the empty hall, I felt genuinely ready to make them face it. Then my phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number that read, "Be careful, Evan. Some lines, once crossed, don't come back." And that's where I stopped, because a choice had to be made. I could lay the timeline bare and force the family to defend what they'd done in front of people they respected, or I could keep sharpening the blade, pulling threads until the whole fabric unraveled on its own. I folded the paper, straightened in my chair, and realized how much I had already changed, how different calm felt when it was fueled by the intention to reclaim something that had been stolen. I told Mrs. Albright to sit back and listen, and then I began. When I set the papers down on the table, the cafe seemed to rearrange itself around the moment. Conversations softened. The hum of the espresso machine became the soundtrack to something heavier settling in. Mrs. Albright looked at the timeline, at the screenshots, at the printouts from Marco, and then back at me with eyes that were suddenly very exacting. The classmates I'd invited shifted in their seats like people waking up. "Read it," I said. I started slow, because slow is how you make a story credible. No theatrical flourish, just facts. I had the ceremony time-stamped photographs, the empty hall photos I'd taken that evening, the voicemail from my mother saying they were waiting, Marco's reservation documents with Ezra's name on them, and screenshots of the Instagram stories with the captions. I had the messages from Lila where she'd told me not to make this about me, and Ezra's smug video toast. I had the timelines printed, neatly labeled, and a list of people who'd seen me at the ceremony and were willing to corroborate. I told them what had happened, the short version first, then the details. I explained how I'd gone to the hall expecting a surprise that never arrived, how I'd sat alone for hours while my family celebrated elsewhere, and how the next morning they had started shaping the story to make me the villain. I showed them the receipts and Marco's message. I read my mother's voicemail, and then, because moments like this demanded, I played Marco's voice note where he said, plainly, "They told me not to seat him." I felt bad. It didn't seem right. When I finished, the silence felt like a held breath being released. Mrs. Albright was the first to speak. "This is not a small misunderstanding," she said. "This reads like deliberate exclusion." She looked around at the other alumni and a few professors who had shown up. Their faces were matter-of-fact, not dramatic. I realized then that what I thought of as my family's social fortress relied on people not asking too many questions. That afternoon, I posted a concise, factual account on the alumni board and a private message thread for a few trusted professors. Nothing accusatory, just the timeline, the receipts, and Marco's statement, and a note that I was available to talk in person. I was careful, no grand proclamations, just evidence and witnesses. Within 24 hours, the narrative had shifted outward. Alumni I'd only met once sent messages of support and expressions of dismay. A professor I respected forwarded my post to someone on the alumni board with the comment, "This deserves an airing." Mrs. Albright called my parents, not to accuse, but to ask them what had happened. That was the line that began to fray. You can't spin your way out of a conversation you have to have with someone whose memory and reputation you can't reshape by tears and whispers. When my parents called me that evening asking to meet, their voice was sharp with feigned hurt. "Why are you dragging this into public?" my mother asked. Her tone had a practiced tremor. "You always make things bigger than they are." "I posted facts," I said calmly. "I left screenshots and times. People who weren't family will now know what happened." "You don't understand how much we sacrificed," my father said. "We were trying to protect a family moment." "Protect a family moment by excluding me?" I said. "That's not protection. That's control." They tried the old maneuvers, blame the misunderstanding, suggest I'd misread things, hint that I was being dramatic. But there was a difference now. I had proof, and my proof had been seen by people who wouldn't take my parents' word at face value. Mirielle called me the next day, her voice syrupy and infuriating, trying to turn concern into weaponry. I let her talk until she grew tired. Then I told her exactly what Marco had said. I asked a single, simple question. "If you knew it was true, why did you still post that caption?" There was a pause that sounded like air leaking out of a balloon. Mirielle's reply was thin, something about family decisions and protecting everyone's feelings. I didn't need to dig further. The conversation itself had exposed what I already suspected. They'd chosen to hurt me deliberately, and then they'd doubled down by rewriting the story to make me the problem. The consequences started to happen, slow but inevitable. Ezra's network began closing in ways I'd nudged, but it was the social fallout that stung hardest for my parents. People who had always nodded and smiled at them in society circles stopped replying to invitations. Mrs. Albright called and said she couldn't, in good conscience, host the little garden party my mother loved to plan. "It's not my role to police family matters," she said, "but I can't pretend I don't see what's on that paper you gave me." At work, a few people who'd been on the fence about Ezra began to pull away. The recruiter I'd messaged came back with a gentle note. We value reliability. Reputation matters. I didn't spread rumors. I simply allowed the factual threads to do what facts do. Expose patterns that had always been there, but were now undeniable. Lila's role collapsed fastest, because betrayal among the people closest to you is easier to document and harder to defend. I sat with her one afternoon, the way I'd sat with her before she left. She tried to explain, said she had been caught up in the family's version of events, that she hadn't known they'd exclude me. I played her voice messages back to her. The words, "Don't make this about you," landed on the table like a physical object. When she saw it in print, the color drained from her face. I thought apologizing would fix it, she said finally, pleading. You hit it, I replied. You were part of the performance. She left that evening with her bag and a look that mixed guilt and anger. She called a few times afterwards, asking if we could try to talk. I answered once, to tell her I needed distance. She begged. I told her there would be no circle back. That was both the cruelest thing I'd ever said and the clearest truth I'd ever spoken. I wasn't interested in being soothed back into a life where my feelings were optional. My parents tried damage control in other ways. My father called longtime family friends asking for favors. My mother wrote carefully worded letters apologizing to anyone who felt offended, while avoiding admitting exclusion. Mirielle kept posting pictures, but the captions grew defensive and then sparse as fewer people liked and commented. Social proof, once fragile, had become brittle. Then came the moment I'd been preparing for, the fulcrum of everything. A small, civil meeting with Mrs. Albright, a couple of the alumni, and my parents at a neutral venue. I asked for it quietly. I wanted a space where facts could be laid out and witnesses could speak without the private theatrics my family relied on. I brought the timeline and Marco. I asked my professors to be there. It was not a courtroom. It was not a spectacle. It was an opportunity for truth to be heard where it mattered. When they arrived, my parents tried to charm. Mirielle tried to direct the conversation towards forgiveness. But I had witnesses. 2 of my classmates confirmed seeing me at the ceremony. Marco corroborated the reservation and the request that I not be seated. Mrs. Albright, kindly and steady, looked at my parents and said, in a tone that carried both disappointment and clarity, "Why? In your words, was this necessary?" My mother's answer unraveled. She mumbled something about wanting to keep things intimate. My father's mouth moved, but no words came that made sense. People who had once reflexively defended them watched as their rhetoric failed. The alumni were quiet, but clearly uncomfortable. Mirielle, who had always been adept at turning the tide with a whispered half-truth, found herself outnumbered by paper and witnesses. After that meeting, the family's social calendar shrank. Invitations that used to come in predictable monthly cycles didn't arrive anymore. People who used to solicit my mother's opinions started to avoid her name. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic, vengeful sense I'd imagined as a kid. It was consequence, slow, public, and precisely measured. My parents had built their social standing on a network that valued appearances and unexamined stories. Once the story was examined, the foundation shifted. I didn't gloat. I didn't post every detail on social media or orchestrate theatrical exposures. I let the timeline speak for itself, and I let people form their conclusions. Some defended them privately, others distanced themselves quietly. That was enough. It was messy, and it hurt in ways I didn't anticipate, but it also felt like the cleanest, most honest outcome I could have hoped for. As for family contact, I made choices. I stopped answering group messages unless it was essential. I set boundaries, simple and non-negotiable. No more being sidelined, no more performances, no more silent punishments. I told my mother that if she wanted a relationship with me, she needed to stop gaslighting, stop twisting events, and be honest. That honesty never came. So contact dwindled to the minimum necessary. Mirielle tried reaching out weeks later with a letter that read like an instruction manual for how to be forgiven without change. I never replied. Ezra's life shifted in ways that sometimes felt petty and other times felt necessary. He lost a few client leads, not because I attacked him, but because clients began hearing the same pattern in different voices. Overpromising, unreliability, a penchant for theatrics. He was angry. He blamed me loudly to anyone who would listen, but those who mattered to his work started to keep him at arm's length. He tried to stage a comeback with grand gestures and glossy posts, but the texture of his reputation had changed. It no longer thrived on the careless assumptions people used to give him. Lila, understandably, wanted to try to repair what she had broken. She wanted apologies and conversations. I gave a measured one. I told her I would not re-enter the pattern of being second. We parted formally, with no grand declarations, just final logistics and a quiet end. There was pain in that, a real ache. But there was also relief, a space where I could rebuild my life without performing to people who treated my emotions as negotiable. The day-to-day after the fallout was quieter. I focused on work and on friends who'd stood by me. I reconnected with people who had been quietly supportive all along. There were small victories, an unexpected job interview I hadn't considered that led to something steady, and a few invitations to projects that felt genuine. I started to feel like I could plan for a future that wasn't reactive. People asked if I felt satisfied. That's a strange question. Satisfaction connotes a neat finish, a box ticked. What I felt was something else, a recalibration. My family had been exposed for choices they made consciously and with malice, and the world reacted with proportionate distance. I lost some things, some relationships I had once hoped would be different, but what I gained was the freedom of not defending myself against manufactured narratives. Months later, Mirielle threw a party for some mutual friends. Word was that she'd been trying to rebuild, to pull people back in with hospitality. A few mutual acquaintances went. I did not. I learned the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge leaves you hollow. Justice leaves scales tipped back toward balance. I wanted balance, not spectacle. I never forgave them. Forgiveness felt like erasing the harm and letting those dynamics start again. That was not an option. Instead, I put boundaries in place, built alliances outside of a family that had proven itself manipulative, and moved forward. The village that used to validate my family's conduct lost interest once the evidence was plain. That was not a satisfying moment of triumph with dramatic music. It was quieter, empty chairs at events, less eager opinions at dinner parties, and the steady recognition that the people who mattered to me now were the ones who listened without twisting my words. In the end, what happened is this. My family's social standing eroded in small, but meaningful ways. Ezra's image took hits in professional circles. Lila and I parted for good, and Mirielle's whispering influence lost much of its potency. I reclaimed my story publicly and privately. I stopped being the character they wrote for me and became the author of my own next chapter. The situation now is stable, if not tidy. I keep contact with my parents to the extent necessary for family logistics, but it is guarded and transactional. Mirielle's attempts to weave drama still flare up occasionally, but fewer people listen. I've made a few new friends who value straightforwardness over appearances. I left the empty hall in more than memory. I left it as evidence, and that evidence changed how people understood who I was. Do I miss how things used to look? Smiling pictures, anniversary posts, easy invitations? Sometimes. But those were never the thing I needed. What I needed was to not be sidelined on a day that mattered. I got that. I got the truth heard. I didn't forgive them, and I don't plan to. Villains are villains because they keep choosing that role, and I refuse to play along. If anyone asks, I'll tell them the short version. They excluded me. They lied about it. I collected the facts, and I made sure the facts were heard where it counted. That's the end of the story for now. I'm rebuilding the life that follows, for myself, by myself, and on my own terms. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.